Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatiron Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatiron's Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatironstuning.com and stay tuned with Flatiron's Tuning. All right, folks, welcome back to the Flatiron Syndicate Podcast. I'm here today in the shop. This is a little bit of an impromptu episode, but what prompted this is we got a Modena R180 differential in the shop. Took it apart, decided, let's take a look at this, and I threw up a picture on YouTube, and I said, hey, what do you guys want to know about this diff? And you guys came in with a bunch of good questions, and what I decided to do is actually just going to go through the questions that have come through as of this morning and answer them, because there's a lot of good questions in there. Obviously, there's a lot of good questions about diffs, and you guys want to know more about diffs, so I want to just basically make an episode talking, addressing all these questions, so hopefully that helps. And then we're going to also do a deep dive on this Modena differential. Why would you want it? What's different between it and the Cusco differential? That sort of thing. So, without further ado, I'm just going to go down the questions, read them one by one, and answer them. Now let's see. So the first one is really good. Mr. Bobdo Belina. So can you make an episode on Subaru diff pros and cons, stock versus aftermarket options, and how we can use them to our advantage, say for daily driver, track use, loose surface, etc.? Great question, very broad. So I'm gonna try and do as comprehensive an answer to this as I can. But if after listening to this you've got more questions or more specific questions, definitely leave them in the comments below. So the pros and cons of stock versus aftermarket, I would say really. Stock, the disadvantage is if you have an open differential. If your car has an open differential in one of the locations, that works okay for driving on the street. But for any kind of aggressive track use, racing, that sort of thing, then that open differential is really not doing any favors. So that's where an aftermarket diff would come in. If your car, say like an STI, has a differential, some kind of torque biasing or plated differential from the factory, that's one of the reasons like that SCS had that, because that offers a lot more performance advantages. And then really like the difference between stock and aftermarket in those cases would be, where does this torque biasing or locking differential that you got from the factory, is it just not aggressive enough, does not have the behavior that you need for the track driving that you're doing, and then that's where you would look to an aftermarket differential. Open differentials, like all the WRXs, all the differentials, all the open, all the WRXs here in the US had open differentials up front. I don't think that there was any model of WRX that ever had anything other than an open diff up front. Now, like basically from 2008 on, like to present day, now the WRXs have open differentials front and rear. And so with your yaw control, traction control, and all that sort of thing, what they're doing is you get an open diff, so there's no mechanical connection in the driveline between the left and right wheels of an axle. They're using brakes, the brakes to grab on to the wheel that's spinning to slow it down, to try and get a little bit of that motive force to go to the other side. And it works reasonably well, but that's where, really as you start driving on the track, it can just kind of start to falter, and you can start to see the limitations of that. And that's where, stepping up to an aftermarket differential is beneficial. For track driving, the front diff is probably the first thing in a WRX that you would notice a big difference by putting in. Because like when you drive an STI, it just feels like you've got a ton of front end grip. When you're in a corner, hitting the apex, getting on the throttle, it just feels like the car's on rails, and a lot of that in an STI is from that front differential. Now it's with the matching rear differential and the DCCD, but that front differential is a big part of it. If you put a torque biasing front differential into a WRX, you get a lot of that front end grip feel that the STI has. That's one of the special sauce things for an STI. So as you start driving on the track, like really what it comes down to with track driving, where you probably start to want to look at your differentials, is as you start to go faster and faster, you get to the point where you're running, track specific brake pads, track-specific tires, aggressive tires like these 200 treadwear cheater tires, Hoosier slicks, that sort of thing, where you have a lot of grip and you're really starting to get to the point where you're using all of that grip and getting towards the limit of friction. That's where having an aftermarket differential is probably going to help. If you have if you can figure out if you've got any kind of wheel spin issue, with any kind of open diff or torque biasing diff, wheel spin will pop up. That's kind of the limiting factor, where the torque biasing diffs or the open diffs, they're not doing you any favors. And so, like, power wise, I'd say 400 to 450 horsepower. That's where like hitting an apex, getting on the throttle, you can start to see a tire break loose. If with cameras, wheel speed sensors, something. I mean, Scotty at the shop here years ago discovered that he was basically having the rear inside tires spin, and it was because of a noise that he would hear. So he would hear a noise basically on corner apex as he was getting on the throttle, and I think it was actually through a camera at the rear wheel. We figured out that it was actually a wheel that was spinning, put in a differential that fixes the problem, and he actually found time there. I've actually had customers a couple of times call in because they think they have a clutch that's failing, and discuss and find out, well, it's because the clutch is slipping when I'm on track and I'm hitting a corner. And it's like, well, that's actually not your clutch slipping. That's your tire that's slipping. And it's, the E-diff or whatever is just not able to keep up. So when you start to run into that wheel slip issue, that's where a plated diff would come in. On loose surfaces, like so for rally, in our rally car, it really, diffs are key, absolutely key to getting the car to be able to carry speed and give you control in a corner. We played around with torque biasing diffs very briefly, and our driver at the time was Stefan Verdier, and he was just like, this is not working, for reasons which we'll probably get into at some point. So we switched to a plated diff, and we've never looked back, because that then got us to work, got the rally car to work the way that it does. In a loose driving situation like gravel, where the car is just always sliding, your wheels are always going to be spinning. And that's why you need a plated diff to really get the car to work well in those conditions, because with the wheels always spinning, you've got to have that plated diff to be able to grab and lock and basically get the wheels on an axle to spin at the same speed. In a rally car, one of the key pieces of the puzzle is a plated front diff. And there's somebody else asked a question about one way, 1.5 way, 2 way, and all that. So we're going to get more into that in detail a bit later. But in our rally car, we've always run a one-way diff, and that works really well, because then you're getting lock under acceleration, but then if you lift off on the throttle, the diff unlocks, and then you can still turn the car. So it doesn't make the car feel like it won't turn at all, just on throttle, it locks up. The reason that front differential is so important in a rally car, and the rear differential too, they're all important in a rally car, but the front differential is really key, because in a car when you're sliding and you're counter steering, the car's going around a corner and you're counter steering into it, having those front wheels lock basically gets the front wheels to act as your rudder. It gives you a lot more control through the wheel for, what kind of attitude the car is going to take through the corner. You have so much more control with that plated front diff, the locking front diff, so that you can carry more speed. You have control with the wheel and the throttle, and that's where you can carry a lot more momentum through the corners. You come out, and then basically everything's locked up, and then the car just shoots out of the corner. If you don't have that, then you're basically, once you initiate the slide, the only tool that you have to really control the slide is the throttle and the brake. So throttle, you can give more throttle if you need more angle. You can come off the throttle if you need the car to tighten up. Brake is really like you've overshot it, and you've got that's kind of like the worst case scenario, and you need to kind of like control the car down. But without those front wheels locked and giving you the control with the steering wheel for kind of the arc that you're carrying through the corner, you're kind of, once you break traction, you're kind of a passenger to about 50%, because you only have the brake and the throttle as controls. Once you really have an effective control with the steering wheel in that rally car, that's where, again, you just have so much more control, so you can carry more speed, much more momentum through the corners, and that's where you find time. I think we've talked about it a few times on the podcast. One of the local rally guys, Jeff Huser, was developing his car, and we talked through all of this, and we got him set up with basically front, center, and rear differentials. And he immediately, like, it took him half a rally to figure it all out, and then he was just immediately faster and had more control, and it was just kind of like, the light bulb went off, and like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be, and away he went. But that being said, like, those aggressive diffs, that works great on loose surfaces where you're sliding a lot, but that would, it would be terrible for driving on the street. And the handful of times where I've had to drive our rally car on the road, the thing is that, like, going straight is fine, but if you turn the car like as you normally would do, like, the one example that got me the most was a cloverleaf on ramp where you're just kind of sitting there at an angle. Like, it was so hard to get the car to go around this, because if I was on throttle at all, the front diff was locking up, as was the rear, and then the car just wanted to go straight, and I literally could not get the car on throttle to go around this cloverleaf. So I had to lift off the throttle to get everything to loosen up, and then I could steer, and I almost actually spun the car because I was trying to get the car to go around the cloverleaf, and I'm on throttle, I'm applying more and more steering, the car wouldn't turn, and then, like, I started to kind of figure out what was going on, and I lifted off the throttle, then all the diffs unlocked, and then the front end bit, and the car just, like, snapped, and so I had to, like, immediately, like, counter steer. Like, it's just not ideal for daily driving. And there's ways to set up plated diffs, but generally, plated diffs really are for high power track use, R compound tires, and rally. Yeah. Okay, so that is a lot to answer that question. Hopefully all of that makes sense. Let's move on, and I think with a lot of these other questions, we're going to kind of fill out maybe some more of the questions that you have with this. The answer to this first one. So the second question here comes from RickCam8616. Says, how do we know which differentials fit which WRX models when wanting to do a 6-speed swap? For instance, he has a 13 WRX hatchback. So we have a 6-speed swap FAQ, and yes, when you're doing a 6-speed swap, you have to make sure that your rear diff matches and has the correct ratio for the 6-speed that you're using. There are two different ratios of 6-speeds. Two different transfer ratios of the 6-speeds. The early 6-speeds, the 04, 05, and early 06s had a 1-to-1 transfer ratio, which means that you need a 3.9 rear ring and pinion. But then late 06 on to 2021, they all had a 1.1-to-1 transfer gear, which means you need a 3.545 rear ring and pinion. So again, the 6-speed swap FAQ, I've got a part in there, and I'll answer your question, RickCam 8616, with a link to that FAQ video in that timestamp. But the short answer is you need to take the transmission code from your 6-speed, figure out which transfer ratio your transmission has, and and what rear diff ratio it requires. Make sure that your rear diff matches your 6-speed transmission. Okay, so next one here. This is from Chopped86. On the topic of differentials, would love to hear your opinions on Wavetrac. How Wavetrac would perform if they decided to bring it to Subaru, and how it would stack up against other differential options. Looking for a differential and everything currently available makes me sad because I can't have a Wavetrac. Maybe there's something I'm missing or I'm not considering. So Wavetrac differentials. We talked to these guys actually 5 or 6 years ago. Okay, so to answer this question, first and foremost, there's a video about how differentials work. So go back and watch that, or how to set up a plated differential. And we talk about torque biasing differentials in there, and I've got a picture. So go back and watch that if you haven't already. But the Cliff Notes version is there's basically 3 types of differentials. Open, which means that there's really no connection between the left and right wheel. So if one wheel spins, then basically the driving force of that axle is basically lost. 2 is a torque biasing differential, where you have gears. So they're currently pretty much all of the torque biasing differentials that I've seen have basically got gears stacked up, and basically it's these set of gears that cross over left to right, and that's what connects your left wheel to the right wheel. And then you have a limited slip differential or a plated differential, where you have these plates, clutch packs and friction plates that connect the left and right wheels. That is a locking diff. So the thing with the with a torque biasing differential is that the best way to think of it is say you have 100% of torque going into the differential. The torque biasing diff will make sure that all of that 100% of torque is used. If both wheels have even traction, it's going to be 50-50. If you have, say, 80-20, so 80% of traction on one wheel, 20% of traction on the other, it's going to distribute that torque, so 80% of the torque goes to the one wheel that has that traction, 20% to the other. The trick with the torque biasing differential with these gears is once you break traction, once one side has zero traction, then it will revert and behave like an open differential because there's nothing in there. It basically, the tire that's slipping is able to just absorb or take in all of that torque. And so you lose driving force at that axle. This is why when we tried putting in a torque biasing front diff with the rally car, we knew that it was wrong because you did not have this level of control that I described with the front axle, for instance. So Wavetrac, what did Wavetrac do? Well, they tried to make a differential that splits the difference. So it's a torque biasing differential, but inside there is a basic, basically it's like a ramp that when with one wheel slips, the ramp moves and it moves this disc into the center that grabs the other wheel. So the idea here is that it's basically a torque biasing differential and a limited slip differential in one. But the limited slip part only kicks in when you have no traction. So on paper, in some ways, this is like, and probably where Chopped 86 is coming at this, it seems like it's the perfect solution because for 99% of driving, a torque biasing differential is kind of the best because it just makes sure that all of the traction that you have is being used. You're not creating any artificial lockup from the differential, which then, like the example I was giving you with the rally car where the front wheels won't turn because the diff is locked. You're not creating any kind of a situation like that. This is why I think Subaru went to all torque biasing differentials in the STI so early on, 2000, I think from 2007 on. All the STIs had front and rear torque biasing differentials. And the nice thing about a torque biasing differential, in my opinion, is it makes an all-wheel drive car feel like you think an all-wheel drive car should feel. And what that means is that, what I mean by that is you're in a turn and you're on throttle and the car just sticks. It feels like it's on rails. You're applying throttle and you're going faster and the car is just on rails. And like this is the setup that I have in my WRX currently, and like when I was on track, provided you have your suspension set up properly, like when you get towards the edge of traction, because you're in the Subaru, you're running square tires, the car will just kind of evenly drift to the outside to tell you that you're going too fast. In certain circumstances, sure, you can get the rear to rotate or whatnot, but it just basically feels like it's glued to the road. You set the angle of the corner with the steering wheel, and the car just holds it and it accelerates. That's kind of what we think of how an all-wheel drive car should feel, and that's what a torque biasing diff does. But again, as discussed earlier, torque biasing diffs have that issue when one tire starts to slip, where all of a sudden it diverts to open. You can have all these sorts of problems. So Wavetrac, in theory, fixes that by then having this cam lobe come up and just lock, so that now you have this locking diff. The weird part about a Wavetrac, and I just don't know how it would work exactly, is you're basically transferring from a point where a wheel slips and you have kind of zero traction to full lock. And so some people seem to like them, and they seem to be reasonably more popular in rear-wheel drive applications. And I think it's because, again, you don't have the rear wheels locking up all the time, like with the plated differential. So it's kind of, the car feels more normal. And then when something slips, it locks. So it's probably okay. I think if anything, it would be okay in the rear. In the front, I think it would kind of be bad because like you're again, think about a torque biasing differential. The car's just on rails. You've set it into the corner. You're accelerating. And then something happens, like you hit the paint on the inside of the curb or whatever, and the tire slips, and then everything locks, and then the car just shoots to the outside. So really, I'd probably say only in the rear would it make sense, possibly. The other thing is just packaging. I think packaging is a challenge for Wavetrac, and this is where we just never really pursued it. The clutch pack that they're using, or the cam lobe, that they're using inside to lock everything up is very small, and it has to be because it's tucked inside of the gears for the torque biasing differential. So your potential lockup is less because it's just so small, and it's just one kind of lobe. Yeah, I don't know. There's a it seems like almost in like off-road applications, like for trucks and whatnot, is where Wavetrac really, that's like the majority of their market. And there again, I think it would probably work, but I would also suspect that like if you're going off-road and you really need like full lock all the time, that's where you put in a locker. You would not go with the Wavetrac. So I know it's an interesting solution. I see what they're doing. It's really the biggest question I have is the transition between the differential functioning as a torque biasing diff to being locked up. Like what is that going to feel like, and what is that going to do to the car? I could definitely see it unsettling the car, in a corner, because the behavior, the way that the power is being transferred to the axle changes if you have a wheel that slips. So yeah, I think really the more consistent behavior out of just a true torque biasing differential or a properly set up plated differential, I think for track use is going to be more ideal. Like, a chopped 86, I'm guessing you've got a GT86 or BRZ or whatnot. Again, rear-wheel drive, I definitely have seen, in the BMW community for a while, people were really excited about Wavetracs for rear-wheel drive BMWs for the non-M cars, because M cars already have the plated diffs in them. It might be interesting there for a BRZ. Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe I'll have to reach out to Wavetrac and see if they've spitballed anything for a BRZ or whatnot. Next question here, Canadian onlooker. So I think this is about the Modena differential specifically. Is it a one-way or two-way or a split? When picking a diff, which lockup and specs are best for rally versus street, aggressive road racing, etc.? Great question. So, all right. So to specifically answer about the Modena, it's a two-way, and it has the same degree of lockup in acceleration and deceleration. And again, go back to the differential video where I talked about how that works. The interesting thing with Modena is it's the same degree of lockup in both directions, but there's two different angles. So there's two different settings for how aggressively you want the diff to lock up, but it's going to behave the same in both directions. Modena actually makes a lot of differentials for Porsche, and you can, with all these plated diffs, the angles that the planetaries are pushing to lock the diffs up, there's a lot of different options out there, and you can basically just take the center section out and replace it with a different one. They make a lot of 911 diffs, and the 911 diffs, from what I understand, are interesting because they're backwards of what you'd think of with like a Subaru, where you'd want maximum lockup under acceleration and minimum lockup under deceleration usually. The Porsche diffs are exactly the opposite, because with the 911 you've got so much weight in the rear, you don't want the rear end to snap around on you. That's kind of their behavior that you always are trying to correct. And the way that they do that is that they have a lot of diff lock under braking or under deceleration, so that the wheels are locked and the car's going to want to go straight. It's not going to come around on you. And then they have so much traction in the rear naturally that you don't really need a lot of lockup, because you just have natural traction, and that way the car can turn more easily because you're not locking up the wheels and forcing left and right rear wheels to turn at the same speed. So if you want, one way, 1.5 way, 2 way. So the one way means you're only getting lockup under acceleration, and then there's no lockup under deceleration or braking. 2 way means you have equal lockup in both acceleration and deceleration. And 1.5 way is largely a nomenclature used by Cusco and some of the Japanese manufacturers, where you have a much more aggressive, the maximum aggressive ramp angle under acceleration, and then half of aggressive ramp angle in deceleration. So you have max lockup under acceleration, and then about half of that lockup under deceleration. So why would you want lockup under decel? So in the rear, so lockup under acceleration makes pretty much makes sense in most applications, because if you're trying to accelerate, that's where it's going to be easy to break traction. You want those left and right wheels locked together so you're getting maximum traction, so you can accelerate the car as fast as possible. Under braking, sometimes what you want is you lift off and you want a little bit of lockup, because then that lockup will kind of help initiate rotation in a corner. For us, we've always pretty much run a 1.5 way diff up until this point, because that half, the less aggressive ramp angle under decel, it's still enough to initiate the rotation, but then the car can still turn. It's not so much lockup that it makes the car feel like it just doesn't want to turn at all, even just from the rear diff. Two-way, for a lot, basically up until this point, it just has seemed too aggressive. Now, we did run the Modena diff up Pikes Peak this year, and it worked really well for us. And so I think that is maybe the exception. And there's, in the Modena video, we'll go into the details of how that diff is put together and why it probably is working better than other two-ways would. But yeah, so generally in the rear, 1.5 way is probably enough. I think a one-way, you're losing that lockup under decel to get the car to rotate. And I think that's a disadvantage. Even in our rally car, we've only run it a 1.5 way. I would say you'd only want to go to a 2-way in the rear if you're not getting enough, lockup to initiate rotation. But in a rally car, it's such surfaces, you really shouldn't need a ton of lockup to get that car to rotate. So yeah, the 1.5 way has always worked for us. For the front, we've always run a 1-way because, like I was describing in the beginning, 1-way, when everything is locked under acceleration, the car when you have traction, the car is going to feel like it just doesn't want to turn. There are ways that you can set up the diff, a front diff, to minimize that, but in doing so, you're taking out the preload. You're making it so that there's got to be a bigger and bigger wheel speed differential to get that lockup up front, and so you can kind of start to have more wheel spin issues and get less of the benefits for the clutch type front diff. So you don't have that pull out of a corner as much as you would like to get the car to feel like it turns more. So the 1-way is as much as I would recommend. And really, a torque biasing front diff is the better solution until you get to the point where you have enough power where you're breaking a tire loose. So in front, I really like torque biasing front diff and then a plated 1.5 way in the rear for a lot of applications for track driving. Really, it's just like if you're sliding all the time, like in rally, that's where, the 1-way front, 1.5 way, or maybe 2-way in the rear, but probably 1.5 way in the rear. That's where that seems to be a really good solution. For the street, if it's just street driving, really, like I was saying earlier, front and rear torque biasing differentials, they give you the best performance, and they still work okay in the winter. I would only even consider putting plated diffs in a street car if you live somewhere where you got a lot of snow, you're driving a lot on ice and snow, mud, slick conditions. That's where something like a plated diff would be an advantage. And that's, like, for instance, that's how the STIs came in. I think it was 2004. Here was the only year they had a plated diff front and rear. I think some of the Japanese STIs had plated front and rear. Maybe 02 and maybe it was 03. But what they did is they took a lot of the preload out of them. So the problem that they had to do that because it was a street car, and so you just weren't getting nearly as much lockup. And then the problem is, you start to make more power, you put on sticky tires, and now this factory plated diff, it just doesn't have enough grab for the tires that you're running, and then you'd have to go back and either rebuild it, replace it with an aftermarket, or rebuild it to really dramatically increase the preload, which there actually was a Group N kit for that, which I don't know if it's still around. You'd have to adjust it to get it to behave the way that you wanted. So yeah, I think, I hope that answers the question. But yeah, so torque biasing front and rear diffs for street application. For tarmac, probably 1.5 way rear, torque biasing front, and then once you get to the higher power levels, sticker tires, that sort of thing, then plated front and rear. Okay, next question. Yucca Head 13. I recently swapped my daily 2023 VBWRX with a full 2019 STI drivetrain. Could you do a video about the benefits, if any, about upgrading the diffs in a daily driver in occasional track car? Again, great question, and we've kind of talked about that and answered that question to this point, but I'll just kind of reiterate. So if it's a 2019 STI, you have torque biasing front diff, torque biasing rear diff, DCCD in the center. Really, that should work well for you up to the point where you're just making, if you tune the car to make a lot of power to the point, especially where you're starting to have issues with wheel slip, could well be in the rear where you would run into it first in cornering, or if you're running, sticky tires, like really, Hoosier Slicks, Cheater 200 treadwear tires that have lots and lots of grip. And so you're driving to the point where you're really towards the edge of that grip, even with those sticky tires. That's where, upgrading probably the rear first to something like that 1.5 way that we just talked about would be beneficial. But if you're not having issues with acceleration out of the corners or tire slip with the front or rear inside tire coming out of corners, the torque biasing differential should be just fine for you. I think I'll just leave that there because I've talked about that pretty much in depth to this point. But if you got more questions or more specific questions about your situation, leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. Next question was from Big Slick Rick 75. Why are the diffs changed out from stock to aftermarket for track use? What are the difference between the stock diff and aftermarket diffs that make them better for track? So we've talked about the why. Again, what makes them better? That I could talk a little bit more to that. So really, it's the consistency of behavior is the key, and this is again actually the issue for Yucca had there with the torque biasing diffs. When you have a situation where you're going to have a tire slip that breaks loose in this really tight corner, but then it works fine everywhere else. So then it can be troublesome because you have inconsistent behavior from the car. With the torque biasing diffs, especially because you can have this one corner that's maybe it's off camber or it's on camber or you're using the curb on this one corner and it's slick versus these other corners you're not hitting the curb and so you're on the proper track as you've got more traction. It's that inconsistency in behavior of the diffs that make it really challenging because you really want to be able to use the car in the corner and apply the power consistently, know what the car is going to do. And when you start to get these inconsistent behaviors, for one, it can easily be overlooked that it is actually the differential behavior that's causing the inconsistency. You can go down rabbit holes, like I mentioned, somebody thought their clutch was slipping. It can be down to suspension. Suspension setup can, cause some of these issues. If you've got, too much camber, not enough camber, so that you've got enough mechanical grip that, it's kind of allowing the torque biasing differential to behave well enough, and then something happens to the alignment or the tire or some such where, it's a hot day, so in the morning it's 60 degrees and the tires are in their good window and you've got plenty of grip, and then by the end of the day it's 90 degrees, the tires are getting greasy, and now it feels like you don't have any grip anywhere because of the torque biasing diff. It had traction, but now it doesn't, and so you're getting this inconsistency in behavior. That's why you would upgrade to a plated diff, because one of the biggest advantages with a plated diff is it's going to work the same every time, way more so than a torque biasing diff. And this is kind of, back to the Wavetrac question. That's my question with the Wavetrac, because you've got these two different behaviors that are packed inside of each other, would that actually cause more inconsistent behavior? Because, that would be my concern there. So with the plated diffs, it's the consistency of behavior and the consistency of power application. Knowing that, when you get on the throttle and if you have, front and rear locking diffs and you know what the behavior is, you know that you have a one-way up front, you know that you have a 1.5 way in the rear, then it gives you the ability to really kind of know that the power application is going to be consistent, and so then dial in the driving, dial in your line because you know that the power application is the same. When you have this variability with the torque biasing diffs, it can make it more challenging to really kind of dial in how to drive the car, throughout the day, throughout a session, that sort of thing. The other advantage with the plated diffs is that lift-off lockup. To know that you're going to be able to get more consistent braking because the lift-off lock, especially in the rear, is going to help the car remain straight. And then as you start to turn, it's kind of like it applies a little bit of trail braking force just through the drivetrain naturally to get the car to rotate, to get the nose in to initiate the turn, that sort of thing. That you can only get that kind of behavior from a plated diff. With a torque biasing diff, because it doesn't do anything under decel, if you lift off, there's going to be the weight transfer onto the front just from kind of the engine braking, if you will, but you don't have that lockup in the rear to basically give you more braking force, more weight transfer to the front, and kind of help the rear end loosen up to let the front turn the car. So for track use, that's where, again, like for an STI, the first step that I would recommend, if you get to the point where you're getting into these issues with the factory torque biasing front and rear diffs, it's a 1.5 way rear diff, because you're going to have a little bit more consistent power delivery under acceleration, but you get that consistent lift off nose in behavior too, that you can only get from a plated diff. So and then once you get to the point where you utilize that and you like that, then it's just like fine tuning that rear diff and then possibly bringing in a front diff if power requires and that sort of thing. Okay, next question. Boom and Freeze 7408. Just get a Quaiffe. Not a bad suggestion for WRX. Great suggestion, because Quaiffe, they make torque biasing differentials. Really good ones, in fact. But again, for an STI, you have a torque biasing differential, and so when it comes to a torque biasing differential where there's just the gear connections between the two sides, there can be small variances between one torque biasing diff and another. Types of material, are the gears? Do the gears have some kind of treatment to reduce friction? Some of the manufacturers can apply a little bit of preload to the torque biasing diff to try and help minimize the chance or lessen the times or chances when a wheel would spin. We're default to an open, but it's not that common. The Subaru OE diffs don't do that. And again, it's like I would say with the torque biasing diff, if you're running into the circumstance where you're having that issue, better to switch to a plated diff, which is going to give you all of these adjustments, all of these behavior, the ability to adjust these behaviors that we've talked about, versus trying to like tinker with the torque biasing diff, or possibly something like the Wavetrac where it just locks up. I think the plated diff is better in those circumstances. So Quaiffe diffs, they're great diffs. For an STI, most likely you really don't need it because you already have something that's equivalent to it. But for a WRX, like I said, a front torque biasing diff makes a big difference. In the rear, torque biasing diffs are challenging if you can find one of the older viscous diffs for the rear diff, or at this point, just put in an STI R180 because you've got more power capacity there, and a lot more diff options at this point. The WRX has had an open diff for so long, and for some reason, like Cusco still makes plated diffs for the R160. I know that for a while Quaiffe made rear R160s, but Quaiffe, I'm not sure how easy Quaiffes are to get. For a period of time, the U.S. importer went away. You had to get them out of the UK, and so it was more challenging. But yeah, good diffs. Just torque biasing diff, and so make sure you're not replacing like for like if you decide to get one. Matthew Daniels 7462. Not exactly a question, but I wanted to throw it in here because I'm hugely appreciative of it. It says, y'all give game and knowledge out like you actually care. And thank you, because we absolutely do. It says, whatever the lesson, just let us know in classes and in session. And hopefully that's what these podcasts are. And I wanted to throw this question in because I put up this picture and I got all these questions, and the light bulb went off. I should just go through and answer these questions in a podcast, so that if you guys are listening to the podcast regularly, we've done deep technical discussions, historically. But do you like this format? Because I think this is a fun format, and it's easy for me to kind of just print out the questions and go through them. But if you like this format, let me know. Put it in the comments below. Send us a message through live chat or whatnot, and then it can fire out these questions maybe once or twice a month. What do you guys want to know about this? What do you want to know about that? And we can come by and do this. And the other advantage in answering these questions in this way is, when I answer the questions on YouTube in the comments, obviously if you're the one that asked the question, you get a notification. You can see that. But some of our older videos have got hundreds and hundreds of questions now through the years, and I don't know how good of a resource it is necessarily to have all of these answers buried in the comments. So that was the other light bulb that went off here, is like to answer a group of questions like this, in a similar genre or similar theme in this format where I will put the chapter stops for all these questions. And so now this makes the answers to these questions way more accessible. And so I'm thinking that going forward that this might make a lot more sense to make getting questions like this answered much easier to find and much more usable for everybody else that then would find on the channel, later, this video and get all these questions answered. So if you like this format, let me know in the comments below, and I will try and do this more consistently. Last question is from Bluebug02. Do all gearboxes, 5-speeds and 6-speeds, have interchangeable diffs, and can you go from open to plated? Kind of talked about this, but I'll answer this one specifically here at this point. So 5-speeds and 6-speeds, yes, they have differentials. No, they are not interchangeable. So you cannot put a 6-speed front differential into a 5-speed box and vice versa. The geometry, the sizing of the differentials in a 5-speed box are different from the 6-speed box. And it's different than the split case 6-speeds too. So like when they put the 6-speed transmission, the split case 6-speed transmissions in the WRXs, think of the WRX 6-speed as basically a 5-speed with an extra gear. That's why we call them a 5.5-speed. Different sizing and geometries there also. When you're talking about pairing a transmission and a rear differential. Back to the 6-speed question. So the rear differential doesn't really care what transmission it's paired with, and the transmission doesn't really care what rear differential it's paired with, provided that the ring and pinion ratios for both the front and the rear differentials work and match. So that's back to the earlier question about which rear differential will work with which 6-speed. It's down to the transfer ratio. So what is the front ring and pinion ratio, and what is the required rear ring and pinion ratio to make sure that both axles are driven at the same speed. That's what it comes down to. Now that being said, can you put an R180 behind a 5-speed transmission? Absolutely. Subaru did this, I think, in the version 6, like right before they went to the 6-speed transmission. They had a 5-speed transmission with an R180. You can put an R180 in a WRX. Like if you have a bug-eye WRX, your rear ring and pinion ratio is 3.545 to 1. So if you get an R180 rear diff that has a 3.545 rear ring and pinion, the ratio is the same. It's going to work with the transmission. You could put in that R180 rear diff with your 5-speed transmission. At this point, because there are more differential options for the STI R180, that might make sense. The kicker there, and back to the 6-speed swap FAQs, is you've got to have an axle that has an R180 inner spline, but a 5x100 outer spline. So like Driveshaft Shop makes a hybrid axle. And if you start to mix and match differentials in that way, getting the axles to work actually is a bigger problem than the diffs. Because with the diffs, all that matters is the ring and pinion ratio, and to a smaller degree, the flange to bolt up to the drive shaft. But the big thing is now, like the R180s and the R160s, they have different inner splines for the axles. So you've got to make sure that those work as well. So I guess the short answer is they're not interchangeable. But are there plated options? Yes. Cusco makes plated front and rear diff options for the 5-speed. We've been using those in our WRX rally car forever. They're awesome. Cusco has a ton of different options, and as we've talked about, you can find what you need with that. So that is it. That is all the questions you guys had about differentials, and there was a lot of them, and they were really good, and that's what, again, the light bulb went off, and I wanted to sit down and record this. I'll put this out as the podcast this week. If you guys are still asking questions on that picture, and I missed them, I apologize. More of a motivation to come back and let me know that you like this format, and we'll come back and we'll do this again. So there we have it, a deep dive into differentials, and I am going to still do a deep dive on that Modena diff compared to a Cusco diff, so stay tuned for that. So thanks very much for listening. Thanks for your support as always. We greatly appreciate it. And until next time, as always, stay tuned to Flatirons Tuning. Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.tuning.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.